Hello, educators. Welcome to the Writers Workshop. And if you're coming back, welcome back. My name is Dr. Sarah Donovan. I am an English language arts educator of over 20 years, and currently I'm a teacher educator in Oklahoma at Oklahoma State University. I'm here to share with you resources and experiences from my classroom of the past 20 years that have transformed my life as a writer and have transformed the lives of my students. And they will be the first to stand up and tell you that that has happened. So most of the resources I share with you are tried and true, and I hope that you take them into your specific contexts and classrooms and adapt them in meaningful ways. Today, I'm going to talk to you about writing short stories, and I have a 3-part series here. So they're each like pretty short, 5 to 10 minutes. And I'm going to help you get started into the short stories, how to start drafting, and then as a teacher, how to model that short story practice for your students. So let's get started. So we're going to be writing a short story, and I have the word in there, fiction, because fiction, short story implies fiction, just to remind us. If students want to write a memoir or personal narrative, they should be looking at the personal narrative tutorial. So there are other tutorials out there for you to help with the writing process. The 5-minute routine is really important. If you do this with your students on a daily basis, they have lots of different writing to choose from. There is a heart map protocol where students can gather ideas from their hearts. There's ways of thinking about genre and mode, peer conferencing, how to teach grammar, how to do grading, how to do an open mic, all these different tutorials. So I hope that you check them out because it will make your classroom experience a little bit more rich. There's also specific tutorials on different genres and modes. So we have our short story that we're working on today, personal narrative, informational essays, descriptive paragraph, and then some poetry as well. Hope you check those out too. So part 1 is to gather mentor texts. You're going to notice this pattern as you look across all these different modes and genres, but gathering mentor texts is your very first step. So it's one of the things I love about this is that it is not on you as the teacher to know everything and be great at everything. There's a ton of authors out there that have many resources and have done a great job writing that. Why don't we let them teach the students, right? So let's just borrow from the other experts that we have in the room. Sometimes it's going to be your students. Sometimes it's going to be the book or short story that you have on your shelf. So here's a tip though. Ask your school librarian or your community librarian to gather a bunch of short stories for your classroom so that your classroom can be very rich and full of different examples of short stories. Here's several short story anthologies made specifically for youth, for middle grade students or high school students. I highly recommend that you share several of these with your students because it shows the possibilities of short story, from thrillers to science fiction to cultural stories to realistic fiction to funny stories, all these kinds of different options for your students, because they may be thinking just a very narrow vision of what a short story could be, but once they see the possibilities, they realize that they might have something special to contribute. The other option is just to gather any novels that you have around that you find interesting to your students. That way you can pique their interest with the story and they realize, oh, I can share my story in that voice, or I can try this technique. So we're going to look at a couple novels and that are interest to my students, and we can see what kind of ideas we can get from them. Okay, so Orbiting Jupiter is one of my favorite books by Gary Schmidt. And I think it's great to show this as a mentor text for your students and have them read the first page and then just kind of notice the author's style, the way that the author begins their story, and how they sort of set up the conflict right away. Because one of the things I think that's difficult with short stories is either students have these really wild ideas that don't have sort of a logic to them, so it makes it difficult to move through and find solutions, or they don't have a sense of where they can find their stories. So this is Orbiting Jupiter is realistic fiction. I'm just going to read the first page. Before you agree to have Joseph come live with you, Mrs. Stroud said, there are 1 or 2 things you ought to understand. She took out a State of Maine, Department of Health and Human Services folder, and laid it on the kitchen table. My mother looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at my father. He put his hand on my back. Jack, you should know. Just in these first lines, it's not a lot of words, right? But there's a lot that happens right away at the beginning of the story. So we have characters, Mrs. Stroud, Joseph, Jack, parents. We have this situation. We know they're in the state of Maine. We know there's some sort of folder and a little bit of mystery. We don't know who this Joseph is. We don't know who Jack is, but Jack is the narrator, so we know that it's first person. My mother looked at me. So right away, there's a lot of different things happening here in just the first pages. So I think that's a great way to think about starting our short story that can inspire students. Here's another one, The Best at It. Chelsea and I are playing Just Dance in the basement when my grandfather calls downstairs. It's the last day of your vacation. You kids need to get out of the house. Maybe later, I yell back up. The song comes to a finish and Chelsea throws her arms in the air and bows with a flourish. We're just in the middle of something right now. You've been locked away in that basement all summer, he calls back down. Then his voice grows sly. How about we have a race around the neighborhood? So we have, again, introduction to some characters. We have an older character, and then we have two younger characters that are in the basement having some fun. There's a little action, there's a lead. We kind of get to know the narrator a little bit as well. So this is taking us right into it. We don't really know what the tension is, but since it's beginning with the older character and the two younger characters, we have a sense that they're going to be important. This is historical fiction, and it's told in third person. So this is great to show your students that they don't all have to be first person, they can be third person. And this is Refugee by Alan Gratz. Refugee. Great, great. And this is also has alternating narrators. So that might be something your students might want to try. But short stories don't really have a lot of time for extra narrators. So crack, bang. Joseph Landau shot straight up in bed, his heart racing. That sound, it was like someone had kicked the front door, or had he dreamed it? Joseph listened, straining his ears in the dark. He wasn't used to the sounds of this new flat, the smaller one he and his family had been forced to move into. They couldn't afford their old place, not since the Nazis told Joseph's father he wasn't allowed to practice law anymore because he was Jewish. Right away, we have a sense of the time. It's also part of the title, 1938 Germany. We have onomatopoeia at the beginning, crack, bang. So we have some action happening right away. And Joseph sitting straight up in his bed, right? Or sitting straight up. This action, this scary, this tension right away. And then we have a sense of place and a little bit of backstory. So there's lots happening in this short piece, but students know that they can write historical fiction too. So there's a few other slides on here. This one is really, I love Miss Bixby's Last Day. This is like really funny narrator, which some of your students might really like too. Rebecca Rodebush has cooties. I'm not making this up. We run tests. She came up positive on the cootimeter, all red off the charts. Steve and Brandon and I are full quarantine mode. Steve has his ski gloves on to minimize exposure, even though it's 70 degrees outside. He looks like Darth Vader from the elbows down. Right away, this is a funny narrator, and they're talking about cooties, and we have Topher, which is, that's the main character, with first person, talking about his friends, and talking about Rebecca, who has cooties, and we get the sense that there's kind of a story emerging right away, but we know the characters, and the voice of the narrator is funny and kind of sarcastic, so that's really cool too. So there's a couple other here that I'd love for you to check out. Oh my gosh, I can't skip over this one. The King and the Dragonflies by Case and Callender. Let me just read to you the first couple sentences. The dragonflies live down by the bayou, but there's no way to know which one's my brother. There's hundreds, maybe even thousands, just sitting on tree branches and rocks, baking in the sun, flitting over the brown water that seeps up from the dirt, zipping across the sky, showing off their ghost-like wings, happy in their own dragonfly paradise. Okay, so this one is just brilliant, right? You can ask the students why, but we have a strong sense of place right away, so we know that it's taking place in the bayou. So then the narrator, first-person narrator, but there's no way to know which is my brother. So then there's some tension or conflict. We know that there's something happening in the story between the narrator and the brother. We know that the setting is going to be really important. And there's lots of poetry actually in this writing. Branches and rocks baking in the sun, flitting over the brown water. It's such great imagery here, sensory imagery here, right? Beautiful. Okay, so the beautiful thing, I can say that a lot, is when you look at mentor texts, you can start saying, what makes something a story? What makes something fiction? And while these are chapters in books, the anthologies will also offer an example of how to work through a shorter story. But really, every chapter in a novel functions in some way as a story. There's usually character setting plot, and there's something propelling the plot in each chapter. So their chapters are a really great way to say, you know, we can do some flash fiction, a little short story. So those are great mentor texts, but the students can think about what makes it good, what makes a good story, what makes good fiction, right? And so this is a great way to inductively generate the students' understanding of what makes a good story instead of giving them a list like a rubric and a checklist right away. So it usually revolves around one single theme or climactic event. It always has the basic elements: character, plot, conflict resolution, dialogue, main character, protagonist, antagonist. Short stories usually just present one character. There's not a lot of time for multiple characters. Now, this is where I would caution you if you have students who are so excited to tell something from the Warrior Cats or from Harry Potter or something like the Dragon one's Wings, with the wings, right? Or War of Wings, Dragon Wings, something. Okay, series. Those have a lot of characters, right? And a lot going on. And the short story is not enough time for any of those. One main character, typically one important problem, and the character has to struggle to solve the problem. And the readers have to really be engaged and invested in, like, how are they going to solve this problem, right? What are the obstacles that are going to be in their way? And then the other thing that's important is that the short stories can be in a lot of different genres: fantasy, mystery, historical, realistic. So a lot of times students are limited to just realistic when they realize they could tell a mystery, right? And it could be realistic mystery, and it could be fantasy with a mystery. So giving them some freedom to think about how they want to, what genre they want their short story to live in. All right, so we have looked at mentor texts, thinking about what makes a story good, eliciting some criteria for the short story. And so now the next step is to get into some drafting.